My name is Ruth and Porter, and I was born into chains in Natchez, Mississippi, in the year 1832. The land here is rich and black, fed by the blood of the Mississippi River, and it grows cotton so thick and white it looks like snow has fallen in summer. But I have never known snow. I have only known heat, the kind that presses down on your shoulders like invisible hands, the kind that makes the air shimmer above the fields at midday, the kind that turns your skin to leather and your throat to dust. I do not remember my mother's face. She was sold away when I was 3 years old, taken downriver on a flatboat with 6 other women, their wrists bound with rope. I remember the sound of her crying, a low, animal sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. I remember reaching for her, my small hands grasping at nothing but air. And I remember my grandmother pulling me back, holding me so tight I could barely breathe, whispering into my hair, "Hush now, child. Hush now. You got to be strong." Strength. That is what they told me I needed. Strength to wake before dawn and walk to the fields. Strength to bend my back over cotton plants until the sun went down. Strength to endure the overseer's whip when I moved too slowly, when my basket wasn't full enough, when he simply felt like reminding us that we were nothing. Strength to swallow my anger, my grief, my very self, and smile when Master Thornton walked past, inspecting his property. But there is a difference between strength and survival. I have learned this slowly, painfully, over the 23 years I have lived on this plantation. Survival is what you do when you have no choice. Strength is what you find when you decide that your soul is worth more than your fear. Master Thornton owned me, just as he owned the land, the house, the horses, the cotton. But 6 years ago, when I turned 17, he decided he wanted to own something more. He wanted to own my will, my choices, my very thoughts. He assigned me to work in the big house, away from the fields, away from my grandmother, away from everything I knew. At first, I thought it was mercy. The house slaves had easier work, better food, cleaner clothes. I thought perhaps I had been fortunate. I was wrong. Master Thornton was a widower, his wife having died of fever 3 years before. His children were grown and gone, living in New Orleans and Charleston, leaving him alone in that great white house with its tall columns and its dark, suffocating rooms. He was a man of education and refinement, or so he believed. He read books in Latin and Greek. He played the piano in the evenings. He wrote letters to politicians and philosophers, debating the nature of civilization and progress. And he looked at me as if I were a project, an experiment, a thing to be molded and shaped according to his vision. "You're intelligent, Ruth," and he told me one evening as I cleared his dinner plates. "I can see it in your eyes. You're wasted in the fields. I'm going to educate you, teach you to read, to write, to think properly. You'll see, I'll make something of you." I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence was the safest response. But inside, something twisted. Something cold and sharp settled in my chest. Because I understood, even then, what he was really saying. I will remake you in my image. I will erase who you are and replace it with who I want you to be. And you'll be grateful. He began that very week. Every evening after dinner, he would call me into his study, a room lined with books from floor to ceiling, smelling of leather and tobacco and old paper. He would sit me down at a small table and place a primer before me, the same kind used to teach white children their letters. A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for cat. He would stand over me, watching my fingers trace the letters, correcting my pronunciation, praising me when I learned quickly. "You see," he would say, his hand resting on my shoulder, his fingers pressing just a little too firmly. "You're quite capable. All you needed was guidance. Proper guidance." I learned to read within 3 months. I learned to write within 6. And with each lesson, I felt something inside me growing. Not gratitude, as he expected, but rage. Because every word I learned, every sentence I constructed, every idea I encountered in those books only confirmed what I had always known but could never articulate. I was not property. I was not an animal. I was not a thing to be owned and shaped and controlled. I was a human being with thoughts and feelings and desires of my own. But Master Thornton could not see this. Or perhaps he saw it and did not care, because as my education progressed, so did his control. He began dictating how I should speak. Not like that, Ruth, and enunciate clearly. You sound like a field hand. He began choosing my clothes, plain gray dresses that covered me from neck to ankle, making me look, he said, respectable. He began monitoring my movements, questioning where I went, who I spoke to, what I thought about. You must be careful of the other slaves, he warned me. They will drag you down with their ignorance, their superstitions, their vulgar ways. You're different now. You're better than that. Better. That word haunted me. Better than my grandmother, who had raised me and loved me. Better than the women in the quarters who sang while they worked, who laughed despite everything, who found joy in the smallest things. Better than my mother, whose face I could not remember, but whose love I still felt like a ghost in my heart. I began to feel split in two. There was the Ruth and who existed in Master Thornton's study, the one who read Shakespeare and discussed philosophy, who spoke in careful, measured tones and held her head up and walked with grace. And then there was the Ruth and who lay awake at night in the small room off the kitchen, staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls closing in, feeling her very self slipping away like water through her fingers. He gave me books to read, books he chose, books that reflected his view of the world, books about the natural order of things, about how some people were meant to lead and others to follow, books about duty and obedience and gratitude, books that told me, again and again, that slavery was a kind of education, a civilizing force, a burden the white man carried for the good of the inferior races. And yet, hidden within those same books, I found other words. Words about freedom, about dignity, about the inalienable rights of man. Words that contradicted everything else he tried to teach me. I would read these passages over and over when I was alone, committing them to memory, holding them close like precious stones. All men are created equal. How could he give me those words and not expect me to wonder why they did not apply to me? Master Thornton believed he was being kind, generous even. He told me so often, "You should be grateful, Ruth Ann. Do you know how many masters would do what I've done for you? I've given you knowledge, refinement, opportunity. I've lifted you up from nothing." But he had not lifted me up. He had simply changed the nature of my chains. The iron around my ankles had been replaced with invisible bonds, bonds of expectation, of obligation, of psychological control. He wanted me to internalize my own oppression, to believe that I owed him everything, that without him I was nothing. And the most terrifying thing was that sometimes, late at night, I wondered if he was right. The worst part of living in Master Thornton's house was not the work itself, though it was constant and exhausting, but the loneliness. I was cut off from my people, isolated in a world that was neither slave nor free, neither black nor white. I existed in a strange limbo, educated enough to understand my own oppression but powerless to escape it, elevated above the other slaves in Master Thornton's eyes but never equal to him, never truly human. The other house slaves regarded me with suspicion. I could see it in their eyes when I passed them in the hallways, when I sat at the kitchen table for meals. They thought I had been chosen, favored, that I somehow believed myself better than them. And perhaps they were right to think so. Master Thornton spoke to me differently than he spoke to them. He never raised his voice to me, never struck me, never called me by the casual, dismissive names he used for the others. With me, he was always patient, always pedagogical, always convinced that he was performing some great act of benevolence. But they did not see what happened behind the closed door of his study. They did not hear the edge in his voice when I failed to agree with him, when I dared to question one of his pronouncements, when my face betrayed some emotion he found inappropriate. They did not feel the way his hand would grip my arm when he wanted to emphasize a point, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to leave bruises I would hide beneath my sleeves. They did not know about the nights when he would call me to his study late, after the rest of the household had gone to bed, to discuss some passage from a book or some political development, keeping me there for hours while I swayed on my feet with exhaustion, unable to leave without his permission. Sit up straight, Ruth, and are you listening? This is important. I need you to understand. Always I need. Never you might want. Never would you like to. Everything was about what he needed, what he wanted, what he envisioned for me. I had become his project, his proof to himself that he was a good man, a civilized man, a man who could see potential in even the lowest of creatures and raise them up through the power of his own superior will. My grandmother sensed something was wrong. On Sundays, when we were allowed a few hours of rest, I would walk down to the quarters to visit her. She was old now, her back permanently bent from decades in the fields, her hands gnarled and scarred. But her eyes were still sharp, still knowing. She would sit me down on the rickety bench outside her cabin and study my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. "That man is trying to steal your spirit," she said to me one afternoon, her voice low and serious. "I can see it. He's trying to make you forget who you are." "He's teaching me," I replied, the words automatic, defensive. "He's teaching me to read and write. That's all." "And what good is reading and writing if you lose yourself in the process?" She reached out and took my hand, her skin rough as bark against mine. "Baby girl, don't let him convince you that his way is the only way. Don't let him make you ashamed of where you come from, of who your people are. Education is fine and good, but not if the price is your soul." I wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that I was fine, that I had everything under control. But the words stuck in my throat, because deep down, I knew she was right. I was changing, and not in the ways I wanted to change. I was becoming careful, guarded, always watching myself, always measuring my words and my expressions and my thoughts. I was becoming afraid of my own anger, my own desires, my own truth. That summer, something happened that made everything worse. A new overseer was hired, a man named Caldwell, who had a reputation for cruelty even among men known for their cruelty. He believed that slaves worked harder when they were afraid, and he made it his mission to ensure we were all afraid of him. The sound of his whip became a constant presence on the plantation, a crack that would split the air at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. I watched from the windows of the big house as he terrorized the field workers. I watched as he stripped a man named Samuel to the waist and lashed him 20 times for the crime of pausing to drink water from his canteen. I watched as he grabbed a young girl named Lily by her hair and dragged her across the yard because she had looked at him insolently. I watched, and I did nothing because there was nothing I could do, or so I told myself. Master Thornton seemed unbothered by Caldwell's methods. "The man knows how to maintain discipline," he said when I dared to mention it to him one evening. "You mustn't concern yourself with such matters, Ruth, and you have more important things to think about now." "But Master Thornton," I said, my voice carefully modulated, respectful but persistent, "surely there must be some limit to enough." His voice was sharp, cutting me off. He set down his book and looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something colder. Disappointment. "This is precisely what I've been trying to teach you, Ruth Ann. You must learn to separate yourself from that world. You're not one of them anymore. You're under my protection, my guidance. You should be grateful for that, not questioning my judgment about matters you don't understand. Not one of them anymore." Those words echoed in my head for days, as if I could stop being who I was simply because he declared it so. As if the color of my skin, the circumstances of my birth, the experiences of my life could be erased by a few months of reading lessons and lectures about civilization. But the worst realization came later, as I lay in my small room that night, staring into the darkness. Master Thornton did not see his treatment of me as control. He genuinely believed he was helping me, saving me, elevating me. In his mind, he was the benevolent master, the enlightened patriarch, the man who saw beyond race and prejudice to recognize the humanity in even a slave. The fact that he still owned me, still controlled every aspect of my life, still expected my gratitude and obedience, these things did not contradict his self-image. They were simply the natural order of things, the way the world worked. He could not see that teaching me to read while keeping me enslaved was not generosity, but torture. That showing me a wider world while denying me the freedom to explore, it was not enlightenment, but cruelty. That pretending I had agency while controlling my every movement was not respect, but a particularly insidious form of domination. He had taken the chains from my ankles and wrapped them around my mind instead. The months that followed were the darkest of my life. I felt myself disappearing bit by bit. In his study, I would speak the words he wanted to hear, nod at the appropriate moments, express the opinions he had taught me to express. I became adept at reading his moods, at anticipating his expectations, at molding myself to fit his vision. It was a kind of survival, a kind of protection. If I could be what he wanted me to be, perhaps he would not hurt me. Perhaps he would not sell me. Perhaps I would be safe. But safety at the cost of self is not safety at all. It is simply a different kind of death. I began to have dreams, terrible, vivid dreams, in which I was slowly turning into stone. It would start with my feet, rooted to the ground, unable to move. Then my legs would stiffen, my torso would harden, my arms would freeze at my sides. And finally, my face would become stone, my mouth locked shut, my eyes open but unseeing. In the dreams, Master Thornton would stand before me, admiring his handiwork, running his hand over the smooth surface of my stone face and saying, "Perfect. Finally, you're perfect." I would wake from these dreams gasping, my heart racing, my body covered in sweat. And I would lie there in the darkness, wondering how much longer I could endure this before I truly did turn to stone, before there was nothing left of Ruth and Porter but an empty shell shaped by someone else's hands. The moment that changed everything came on an ordinary Tuesday in October. The air had finally cooled, the oppressive heat of summer giving way to crisp autumn mornings that smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves. I was in Master Thornton's study, as I was every evening, sitting at the small table with a book open before me, Plato's Republic, a text he was particularly fond of. "Read this passage aloud," he instructed, pointing to a section about the ideal state. "And then tell me what it means." I read the words carefully, my voice steady and clear, exactly as he had taught me. The passage described a hierarchical society in which each person had their proper place, determined by their nature and abilities. The philosophers ruled, the warriors protected, and the workers labored. Everyone was happy because everyone accepted their role. When I finished reading, I looked up at him, preparing to recite the interpretation he had drilled into me over countless sessions. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the accumulation of months of suppressed anger and frustration. Perhaps it was simply that I had finally reached a limit I did not know existed until I crossed it. "What does it mean?" he prompted again, his tone patient but expectant. I looked down at the words on the page. I looked at my own hands, one finger still marking the place in the text. I looked at the walls lined with books, at the window overlooking the plantation grounds, at Master Thornton himself sitting in his leather chair, so certain of his authority, so convinced of his righteousness. And I said, "It means that Plato was wrong." The silence that followed was absolute. Master Thornton stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking in tongues. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something darker. "I beg your pardon," he said quietly. I could have backed down. Every instinct I had developed over the past 6 years told me to smile, to apologize, to say I had misspoken, to retreat back into the safe role of the grateful student. But something in me refused. Something in me had broken open, and once opened, it could not be closed again. Plato's ideal state depends on people accepting their assigned roles. I continued, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. It depends on the workers believing they are naturally inferior to the rulers, that their place in society is just and right and ordained by their very nature. But what if that belief is a lie? What if the workers are capable of more than labor? What if the only reason they remain workers is because the rulers benefit from their labor and have the power to keep them in that position? Master Thornton's face had gone very still. "This is a theoretical discussion about ancient Athens," he said, his voice controlled but tight. "You're misunderstanding the context." "Am I?" I closed the book and looked directly at him, meeting his eyes in a way I had never dared before. "Or am I understanding it better than you want me to? Because it seems to me that this philosophy is very convenient for those in power. It allows them to justify their position by claiming it's natural, inevitable, even beneficial for those they rule over. It allows them to believe they are kind, and just when they are simply maintaining a system that serves their interests." "Ruth and..." His voice was sharp now, carrying a warning. "You're overstepping. This is exactly the kind of dangerous thinking I've been trying to prevent. By controlling what I read, what I think, what I say." The words were pouring out of me now, months and years of suppressed truth finally finding voice. "You told me you were educating me, but education means learning to think for myself, not learning to think as you think. You told me you were elevating me, but you only elevated me far enough to see the bars of my cage more clearly. You told me you were making something of me, but I already was something. I was always something. I was always someone. You just couldn't see it because seeing it would mean admitting that everything you believe about yourself, about this world, about the natural order you hold so dear, is a lie built on violence and theft and the systematic destruction of human souls." I stood up, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. My hands were shaking, but I held them steady at my sides. "You don't own my mind, Master Thornton. You own my body because the law says you do. You own my time because you have the power to enforce it. But my thoughts, my beliefs, my understanding of truth, those are mine. And you cannot take them from me no matter how many books you give me, no matter how many lessons you teach me, no matter how many times you tell me I should be grateful." For a long moment, he simply stared at me. I watched emotions flicker across his face: shock, anger, something that might have been hurt. Then his expression hardened into something cold and impenetrable. "Get out," he said quietly. "Go to your room. I will decide what to do with you in the morning." I walked out of that study with my head up, my spine straight, every nerve in my body singing with terror and exhilaration. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I had to fight him not with violence or escape, but with something far more dangerous: the assertion of my own humanity, my own right to think and speak and be. That night, I did not sleep. I sat on my narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the house settle around me, wondering what dawn would bring. Would he sell me? Send me to the fields? Have me whipped? The possibilities turned over and over in my mind, each more frightening than the last. But underneath the fear was something else. Something fierce and bright and unbreakable. For the first time in 6 years, I felt like myself again. Not the careful, controlled version of Ruth and that Master Thornton had been sculpting. Not the grateful, obedient student who spoke only when spoken to and thought only approved thoughts. But the real Ruth and the one my grandmother had raised, the one my mother had loved before she was torn away, the one who had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for this moment. I thought about what my grandmother had said: "Don't let him steal your spirit." Well, he had tried. God knows he had tried. But in the end, he had failed. Because the human spirit, I realized, is not something that can be given or taken. It can be suppressed, denied, buried, ignored, but it cannot be destroyed. And once you remember it's there, once you reclaim it, no one can take it from you again. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, I made a decision. Whatever happened next, I would not apologize. I would not recant. I would not pretend that the words I had spoken were anything other than the truth I had finally found the courage to voice. Master Thornton could do what he wanted with my body. He could sell me, work me, punish me, But he would never again convince me that his vision of me was more real or more true than my vision of myself. I was Ruth and Porter. I was a woman, a human being, a person with thoughts and feelings and the right to define my own existence. And that knowledge, once claimed, could never be taken away. Master Thornton did not send for me the next morning or the morning after that. For 3 days, I went about my duties in the house, cleaning, cooking, serving meals, while he ignored me completely. He took his meals in silence, his eyes never once looking in my direction. When he needed something, he would call for one of the other house slaves. It was as if I had ceased to exist. The other slaves noticed, of course. They whispered among themselves, speculating about what I had done to fall from favor. Some seemed pleased, as if my downfall confirmed their suspicions about me. Others looked at me with something like pity. Only one person, an older woman named Martha, who worked in the kitchen, pulled me aside and spoke to me directly. "Whatever you did," she said quietly as we kneaded bread dough together, "don't you dare take it back. I've seen too many people break in this place. I've seen them give up every piece of themselves just to survive another day. But you, girl, you got fire in you. Don't let him put it out." Her words gave me strength during those strange, silent days. But I knew the silence could not last forever. Master Thornton was planning something, deciding something, and when he was ready, he would act. The summons came on the 4th day. One of the field overseers appeared at the kitchen door and told me Master Thornton wanted to see me in his study immediately. My stomach clenched with fear, but I forced myself to walk calmly, to keep my face composed, to remember the truth I had spoken, and hold it close like a talisman. When I entered the study, I found him sitting at his desk, papers spread before him. He did not look up when I came in, did not acknowledge my presence for several long minutes. Finally, he set down his pen and turned to face me. "I have been considering your situation," he said, his voice formal and distant. "And I have concluded that my experiment with you was a failure. I gave you knowledge, opportunity, every advantage, and you repaid me with ingratitude and insolence." I said nothing. I stood before him with my hands clasped in front of me, my eyes level, waiting. "I could send you back to the fields," he continued. "That would be the logical consequence. Or I could send you down to the deep south where they're less particular about educated slaves and more focused on productivity. But neither of those options satisfies me. They feel like admissions of failure." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over his plantation, his kingdom, his little empire built on the backs of people he refused to see as human. "So, I've decided on a different approach," he said. "You will continue to work in this house. You will continue your reading lessons. But there will be conditions. Strict conditions. You will speak only when spoken to. You will express no opinions of your own. You will demonstrate, through your behavior, that you understand your place and are grateful for it. If you can do this, if you can control yourself, then perhaps, in time, we can repair what you've damaged." He turned back to face me, waiting for my acquiescence, my submission, my return to the role he had assigned me. And I said, "No." The word hung in the air between us, simple and absolute. His eyes widened slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "No," I repeated, my voice steady. "I will not pretend to be something I'm not. I will not silence my own thoughts to make you comfortable. I will not participate in my own erasure." "You will do as I say," he said, his voice rising. "Or I will." "You will what?" I took a step forward, my fear transforming into something else, something powerful. "Send me to the fields? Sell me? Whip me? You have always had that power, Master Thornton. The only thing that's changed is that I'm no longer afraid to acknowledge it. You can control my circumstances, but you cannot control who I am. Not anymore." His face had gone red. "You ungrateful." I am not ungrateful for knowledge, I interrupted. But I will not be grateful for chains, no matter how well disguised they are. You thought you were lifting me up, but all you were doing was teaching me to recognize my own oppression more clearly. And for that, I suppose I should thank you, because now I know exactly what I'm fighting against. You are fighting nothing, he said harshly. You are a slave, a piece of property. You have no rights, no standing, no. I have myself, I said quietly. I have my mind, my understanding, my ability to see truth, and name it. You cannot take those things from me, no matter how much you wish you could. You can punish my body, but you cannot reach my soul. For a moment, I thought he might strike me. His hand actually rose, his fist clenched. But then something in his expression shifted. He lowered his hand and looked at me with something that might have been confusion, might have been recognition, might have been the first glimpse of actual understanding he had ever had about who I was and what he had done to me. Get out, he said finally, his voice tired. Just get out. I left to study and went directly to the quarters. I did not wait for permission. I did not ask. I simply walked out of the big house, across the yard, past the overseer, who called after me asking where I thought I was going. I kept walking until I reached my grandmother's cabin. She was sitting outside, mending a shirt. When she saw my face, she set down her sewing and opened her arms. I collapsed into them, finally allowing myself to feel everything I had been holding back. The fear, the anger, the exhaustion, the strange, fierce joy of having spoken my truth and survived. What happened, baby girl? She asked, stroking my hair. I told her everything. The confrontation, the defiance, the refusal to submit. When I finished, she pulled back and looked at me with tears streaming down her weathered face. Your mama would be so proud, she whispered. So proud. That night, I slept in her cabin, on the floor on a thin mattress stuffed with corn husks. It was uncomfortable and cramped, nothing like my small but private room in the big house. But I slept better than I had in months, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of my people, no longer isolated, no longer alone. I knew there would be consequences. Master Thornton would not simply let me defy him without response. But I also knew that I had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. I had remembered who I was, and that memory had given me a strength I did not know I possessed. Whatever came next, I would face it as myself, fully, completely, unapologetically myself. The consequences came swiftly. The next morning, Master Thornton had me reassigned to field work. After 6 years in the big house, I returned to the cotton fields where I had spent my childhood. My hands, which had grown soft from indoor work, blistered and bled within hours. My back, unaccustomed to the constant bending and stooping, screamed with pain. The overseer, Caldwell, seemed to take particular pleasure in watching me struggle, making comments about uppity house slaves who thought they were too good for honest labor. But I did not break. I worked alongside women I had known since childhood, women who had initially regarded me with suspicion but who now welcomed me back with a cautious solidarity. We worked in lines, moving through the rows of cotton, our fingers flying over the bowls, our baskets gradually filling with the white fiber that was the source of Master Thornton's wealth and the reason for our bondage. And as we worked, they sang. These were the songs of my childhood, songs I had heard my grandmother sing, songs that had been passed down through generations. They were songs about freedom and deliverance, about rivers to cross and promised lands, about a time when burdens would be lifted and chains would fall away. The words were coded, careful, speaking of biblical narratives that were also maps of escape and visions of liberation. I had forgotten these songs during my time in the big house. Or perhaps I had not forgotten them so much as learned to hear them differently, to dismiss them as the simple expressions of simple people, as Master Thornton would have said. But now, singing them again, feeling their rhythms move through my body and synchronize my movements with the movements of the women around me, I understood their power. They were not expressions of resignation, but of resistance. They were not acknowledgments of defeat, but assertions of hope. They were the way we reminded ourselves and each other that this life, this circumstance, this brutal present was not all there was, not all there could be, not all there would be. My grandmother came to the fields during the midday break, bringing me water and a piece of cornbread. We sat together in the meager shade of a willow tree, not speaking much, just being present with each other. "You did right," she said finally, "speaking your truth, standing up. That took more courage than running would have." "I'm not sure courage is the right word," I said, flexing my aching hands. "Sometimes I think it was just stubbornness. Or foolishness." She smiled, her face crinkling into 1,000 lines. "There's not much difference between those things, baby girl. Courage, stubbornness, foolishness, they're all just different names for refusing to give up. And that's what matters, not giving up on yourself." Over the following weeks and months, I learned to navigate my new reality. The work was brutal, the conditions harsh, the constant surveillance and threat of violence wearing. But I was no longer alone, no longer isolated in a world of one. I was part of a community again, connected to women who understood my struggle, because it was their struggle too. And I discovered something unexpected. I could still read and write. Master Thornton might have taken away my access to his library, but he could not take away the knowledge already in my head. In the evenings, after the work was done, I would scratch letters in the dirt with a stick, teaching other slaves what I knew. We had to be careful, secretive. Teaching slaves to read was illegal, punishable by whipping or worse. But we did it anyway, gathering in quiet corners, passing knowledge from one person to another like precious contraband. I taught them to write their names, to read simple words, to understand numbers so they could not be cheated quite so easily. And in teaching them, I reclaimed the education Master Thornton had tried to give me on his terms. I made it mine. I made it ours. Sometimes I would see Master Thornton watching me from a distance. He never approached me directly, never spoke to me again. But I could feel his gaze, could sense his confusion. He had expected me to break, to come crawling back, to beg for forgiveness and a return to my former position. The fact that I had not, that I seemed almost content in my new circumstances, clearly disturbed him in ways I don't think he fully understood. He had wanted to control my life, to shape me according to his vision, to make me into living proof of his own benevolence and superiority. But by refusing that vision, by insisting on my own humanity and my own understanding of myself, I had taken that control away from him. He still owned my labor, still had legal authority over my body, but he no longer had power over my sense of self, my dignity, my soul. And in a strange way, that made me freer than I had been in his study, surrounded by books I could read, but thoughts I could not think. My grandmother passed away during the winter of my second year back in the fields. She died quietly in her sleep, her tired body finally giving out after 7 decades of labor and struggle. We buried her in the slave cemetery at the edge of the plantation, marking her grave with a simple wooden cross. The whole community came to mourn her, to sing the old songs, to speak her name and remember her life.